So, there he is. Who was he? What was he like? It's a legacy plagued by myth and propaganda. We know he was a man of contradictions, but perhaps not as extreme as the stunningly contradictory writing that was done about him. If you go into the exhibit for many years now at the NTS Culloden, the first thing you see on the wall in front of you is a statement reportedly made by Lord Elcho after the call for retreat and the Prince's horse was being led off the field. And Elcho is said to have said in this exhibit, "Run, you cowardly Italian." Except he probably never said that. There are no contemporary reports of anyone who was within earshot of hearing him say that. His own memoirs, and he was the same age as Prince and would seem a bit jealous of him. So he pulled no punches when it came to criticizing the Prince, but Elcho does not mention ever saying that. Professor Mary Pittock did some digging to see where in fact this had come from. And it turns out that the first mention of this line is written by Sir Walter Scott in a story in the 1820s. Now, that is an example of what you run into when you start doing research in Jacobite history. It's full of romantic imagery and nasty propaganda that has followed us down through the years. From the very beginning of people who were writing about the Rising, most of them had an agenda. Some of the agendas were to praise him, some of the agendas were to tear him down. Most recently, in the last few decades, it's been very lucrative to write books that tear down Charles Edward Stuart. A complicated man, and certainly not a perfect one, but as Professor Sir Tom Devine pointed out about Preble, who was probably the most ubiquitous detractor of Charles Edward Stuart, he was not an academically trained historian. His sources were often secondary sources, and he paints a picture which supports his political view that the 45 were terrible aristocrats exploiting poor peasants under the clan system. Considering that MacLeod of Dunvegan gathered his clansmen off Skye to join the government forces, only to have them walk off and join the Jacobites, I think that rather undermines that view. We have sons leaving fathers, we have wives taking different sides from their husbands. It was very much a matter of personal belief and conviction, not a matter of, you work for me, you do what I tell you to. There was some of that with the Fiery Cross, but still, this is a gross misrepresentation of what was going on in the Highlands, which was not a strictly feudal system. As Andrew Lang remarked, some writers use statistics as a drunken man uses lampposts for support rather than illumination. We can only search for synoptic gospels in our look for the truth, and we have, fortunately, a great deal of documentation of eyewitnesses from the time. And if you compare people who did not talk to each other but wrote about it, you can glean the truth bit by bit. And as Dr. Christopher Duffy has frequently said, we uncover new documents and new information every year. It's an exciting pursuit in terms of history because we're revising our opinions all the time. In 1988, the Oxford scholar and famed biographer Frank McLean wrote a meticulously researched 600-page biography of the Prince, which at the time was certainly the first of its like. But even he, we now know, made some mistakes, including yet another old saw that every tour guide who travels the B9006 past Culloden tells all their tourists, that Culloden was lost because Charles Edward Stuart wouldn't listen to his commanders and insisted on a terrible field of battle. That's not true either, and we have lots of evidence, well covered in Mary Pittock's book on Culloden. The day before, they chose the battleground at Newlands, which was about a mile to the east. It was flat, dry, but appropriate for the Highland charge in terms of its contour. They stayed in battle array all day. Cumberland didn't show up, and then they decided to do the night march to Nairn, and therein lies the rest of the history. One of the brilliant aspects of studying the Battle of Falkirk is that we have memoirs of most of the High Command who fought there. And again, it's the Synoptic Gospels. We know that O'Sullivan and Murray disagreed on who was responsible for what, but we can, from all of these memoirs, glean what actually happened and who made the decisions. And what is remarkable about it, to me at any rate, is how well the High Command worked with each other. There were brilliant suggestions that were followed by everyone, and the suggestions came from everyone. And in many ways, I believe that was responsible for the victory on the day. So what do we know about this man? He was born in Rome, the Stuart heir to the crowns of the three kingdoms, and a Polish royal family legendary for fighting off powerful invading forces. Charles Edward's first language was English, which was the language spoken at the exiled Stuart court. This is a letter written by him to his father when he was 8 years old, in English. It basically says, "Dear Papa, I'm sorry I made so much noise and disturbed Mummy." What this letter tells us is two things. One is the language that he spoke to his father was English, and he wrote in it fairly well for an 8-year-old, I would say. It also tells us that his mother was in a nervous state and a vulnerable state, and she would in fact, after the marriage became interfered with by the Vatican, retreat to a convent and literally starve herself to death when Charles was a boy. Maclean claims that this had an enormous effect on him to lose his mother in this way. One thing we can be fairly sure of is that the Vatican's interference in his parents' marriage gave him a rather jaded view of Rome's church, which brings us invariably to the term divine right. It's almost become part of the name Stuart, divine right. Every time they bring up the later Stuarts, they say, and the Stuarts who believed in divine right. It's almost like it's an appendage to the name. But the fact of the matter is that in the 18th century, most monarchs in Europe believed in divine right. The Tudors believed in divine right. The Plantagenets believed in divine right. And we don't say Elizabeth Tudor who believed in divine right. We say Charles I who believed in divine right. This is the power of propaganda. But it wasn't particularly interesting to Charles Edward Stuart, and he did not talk about it very much. The right that he talked about was a legacy of hundreds of years of kings of Scots, which he felt he was part of, which is why he, as Peter mentioned, loved wearing Highland dress to special occasions in Rome. It was an identity that was powerful for him. And as far as he was concerned, when the Duché landed at Eriskay, he had come home. Back in Rome, in February in 1732, a powerful French bishop was dining with the Stuart family at the Palazzo del Re, and was boasting about how his king, Louis XV, had silenced the Parliament. Charles Edward, who'd been conversing in English, suddenly turned around with a vehement question. "Mais monsieur, à quoi peut donc servir un parlement quand on lui demande de parler?" "But sir, what is the point in having a parliament if you do not let them speak?" He was 12 at the time. He excelled in riding, shooting, dancing, and music, playing the violin, the flute, and the cello very well. He loved music, and he and Henry played frequent concerts for their father. He also made a point of learning the Royalist and Jacobite songs of earlier risings. He had less interest in scholarship, and many have remarked that his spelling was terrible and concluded that he lacked intelligence. As someone who struggled with dyslexia for most of my academic life, I recognize his writing. It is also common among people who study many languages as children to confuse spellings, and I suspect that there was some of that at play. Later on, when he befriended the Enlightenment philosophers in Paris and discoursed with them at length, he was not a man you could say had no intelligence or intellect. one of the things that one hears a great deal is that Charles Edward Stuart decided to regain the crown for himself or his father, and the poor Highland clan suffered for it and didn't want him to be there. This is actually contradicted by the many visits of the Duke of Perth, Dunbucket, and other grandees to Rome, begging James to try again. And a brilliant letter written by Hector MacLean and Lochiel saying, "Nothing less than the ruin of our country is intended at present by the government in England. We cannot hesitate a moment to resolve to sacrifice our lives in order to prevent it." So what Charles Edward Stuart was hearing in Rome was, please, please try again, or we will all be ruined. When he was still a teenager, he was sent to the siege of Ghent to gain some military experience. To the alarm of his minder, Dunbar, he rode his little horse straight into the action with musket balls whizzing around his head. Not only did he show great physical courage, but he spent time with the common soldiers in the trenches, speaking to them in their languages and exchanging jokes with them. He would continue to enjoy the company of so-called common men for the rest of his life. As the Comte de Becquerie remarked, he had surely learned what few princes can ever be taught, the worth of individuals, to admire peasants. He had learned to love virtue in all order of men. He was tall and slim, and not what you'd call physically robust. So he went to work to toughen himself physically in anticipation of the great enterprise to come. He would march at dawn to dusk in the wild marshes outside Rome, return to Del Rey, play the cello for a few hours, and then get an hour of sleep and start all over again. This training actually served him in enormous good stead when he led the Jacobite army on foot into England, and also, of course, the 5 months wandering in the hills and the Isles. He was known for dazzling charm, which he used to great advantage. Two qualities which contribute to charm are empathy and humor. His sense of humor was pronounced, even when he was fleeing government troops with a price on his head. When he was installed at Holyrood, he heard that a devoted Edinburgh Whig had been asked if he was inclined to go get a kiss of the King's hand, or in fact, the Prince Regent. The man replied, "I'd rather kiss the Pope's toe." Charles found this so funny, he invited the man to come and visit him. The man went to the meeting a truculent detractor and left a reluctant admirer, and wrote about it. Anyone well acquainted with alcoholism as an addictive disorder can recognize the signs very clearly in Charles Edward. The reports are widespread of his polishing off an entire bottle of brandy or more, or whiskey, each day, and not succumbing to the signs of drunkenness. Of course, to some of the Highland chiefs who started the day with a couple of stiff drams, this was only to be admired. But it's curious that even today, when we fully acknowledge the addiction to alcohol as a serious disorder and not a sign of bad character, the prince is still referred to as that drunk. Alcoholism is often associated with post-combat PTSD, as I learned from my father, who was a paratrooper in World War II. When you've seen your men blown to pieces by artillery and wipe their blood and bone off your face, it does damage to the souls of decent men and inclines them to self-medicate with a bottle. It is evident by the change in his behavior after Murray convinced the High Command to turn back at Derby that Charles knew the rising was probably lost, and his drinking became heavier. This was particularly true when it was confirmed that a large French invasion force had been at the ready to meet them in London. It would never be again. 5 months skulking in the hills and the Isles, relentlessly pursued by government forces. He was famous for keeping up the spirits of his companions with jokes and a lot of drinking. But it must have had an impact on the man himself, and he felt that the depredations that he was hearing about, the terrible destruction of people, property, houses, livestock, he felt that it would stop once he had left, that they were pursuing him and leaving a path of destruction in their pursuit, and of course, it didn't. And to being played as a pawn, both before and after the rising, and the humiliation of having to exist incognito in France, and publicly arrested, imprisoned, and expelled from that country. To spend the rest of your life moving from city to city, only to find the British government had put pressure on that state to have him expelled. It was not a happy life. He was also in extreme pain most of his life. When he was sleeping out on the rough so many nights in the Highlands, his legs became badly bitten by midges, something I'm sure people will relate to. And when he scratched them, his legs became infected. And at the time of his death, his legs were as large as his waist in infection. The desperate efforts he made once he reached France to get the French to fund Rising again are evident in the letters he has written, which we're taking another look at. Some pals of mine and working with Roddy to look at those letters that were written when he got back and examine them more closely. And not only after return to France a hero, did he find that his welcome from Louis was short-lived, but his brother Henry decided to make a move that would devastate him. Henry invited him to dinner, and Charles arrived to find the lights all lit and no one home. He would later discover that Henry had left for Rome to take orders in the Catholic Church, and that his father knew about it and neither of them had told Charles. The letter that Charles wrote to his father when he discovered this, as I'm sure many of you have read, he said it was like a dagger in his heart, because he knew that the spare was then gone, and that the damage that Henry's joining the Catholic Church would do in terms of trying to regain the three kingdoms could possibly never be undone. That was the old propaganda against James VII, was that he would be a Catholic tyrant and the Pope would be running England. He loved twice in his life, for all that we know, both in France and both after he got back. He had two very intense and passionate affairs with two women. There is actually very little evidence that Charles bedded Clementina Walkinshaw at Bannockburn House. It is the speculation by Lord Elcho, because Clementina was so attentive and clearly so adoring of him. But there is no evidence that he actually took her to bed. He was extremely ill, very weakened. He was planning to confront Hawley and trying to figure out how to do that. They were laying siege to Stirling Castle. And she was the virgin daughter of a well-known Jacobite. It just is not in his character to do that. He's not Charles II. But that's another myth that pervades, and we certainly know that Clementina, bless her heart, absolutely fell head over heels because she abandoned her reputation and her family and fled to France to try to join him. He turned her away for a year and told her to please go home, but with the help of O'Sullivan's pleading, he finally allowed her to come and join him. And their relationship was a painfully dysfunctional one. The reports of Jacobites coming and meeting with the prince and viewing terrible fights between them, both of them very drunk, a sadly abusive relationship. There is absolutely no record, however, of his being abusive to the two women that he fell in love with. So this characterization of his being a wife beater or a woman beater was certainly true with Clementina. They were both physically abusive, and it was a horrible relationship, clearly. However, when the English Jacobites thought that she was a spy and told Charles he had to get rid of her, he refused to, because he loved his daughter Charlotte so much and wanted her with him. To listen to those who captured his character you try to find people who are speaking truth and not flattery. And as I'm sure many of you have heard, on the scaffold as he is about to reach his maker, Lord Balmerino stated, "I must beg leave to tell you of the incomparable sweetness of his nature, his affability, his compassion, his justice, his temperance, his patience, and his courage." Likewise, Dr. Archie Cameron, as he was facing being hanged, drawn, and quartered at Tyburn, wrote, "I had the honour to be almost constantly about his person until November of 1748. I can affirm, and my present situation can leave no room to suspect me of flattery, that as I have been his companion to the lowest degree of adversity ever Prince was reduced to, so I have beheld him too, as it were, on the highest pinnacle of glory. And yet he was always the same, ever affable, ever courteous, giving constant proofs of his great humanity and his love for his friends and his country." His enemy, Prince Frederick of Hesse Castle, who was Cumberland's ally, although he didn't like Cumberland very much, found himself entertained in Edinburgh by a group of Whigs and supporters of the Georgian government, who were making disparaging and rather nasty statements about Charles's character. And Prince Frederick replied, "Sir, I know that to be false. I am personally acquainted with him." They knew each other in Europe before the Rising. "He has many good as well as great qualities. He had prudence as well as courage, and is inferior to few generals in Europe." I'd like to finish by offering what I consider a bit of a treat. I hope you do too. The great poet Alistair Alexander MacDonald, one of the warrior poets of the 45, and surely one of Scotland's great poets, wrote a great deal about the Prince because he was his tutor and was with him during almost the entire 45. And he wrote these verses about him. I will ask James MacDonald Reid to read it in Gaelic first, and then I will give you a translation. The first verse is a metaphor, rather horrific actually, to hanging, drawing, and quartering, and that's where the imagery is taken from. The second verse, quite different, uses the illusions of weaving cloth.
Gespien sivan an griasing, sa braliachan sias a hrachgu, hator shavasing charl, gebragas a che chartachgu.
Though you tear our hearts out and render apart our bosoms, never shall you take Prince Charles from us till we are a dying.
Nanam a fuiste, chalmuiste gekroeid die klassen, zolang gaan nu ter oostblok, kom Bjerner en verre dasing.
To our souls he's woven, firmly walked and tightly locked, ne'er can he be loosened from us till he is cut away.